in Berlin since 1995, but also lectured and taught in the States at Columbia and Harvard and MIT. He's currently kind of writing up work on architectural space and has recently published a series of review essays on architectural theory. At the same time, he's been co-editing a book entitled Foreign Affairs, The New Embassy Buildings in Berlin. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you, Ralph. And welcome.
Okay, I see a few faces here that are familiar to me. So, and I suppose that there are other people here that know Berlin relatively well. The lecture is basically sort of oriented to people who really don't know anything at all about Berlin, so I've made a fair amount of effort to pull in some background information as well. It's organized, I'll show a couple of images just about Berlin as a whole, as a city plan, and then there is an introduction about some of the political issues that are going on in Berlin at this point in time. Berlin is a very fascinating city, I find, but the politics of Berlin are very complicated. And to understand the architecture of Berlin and to understand the urban design issues of Berlin, you do have to read them against the political structures, the background. And so with that as a very short introduction, maybe if you can turn on the two projectors. Yeah? Okay. Okay, just as a very short, does this, yeah, okay, keeps working here. As a very short introduction to Berlin, the image on the left shows the original city of Berlin, which was a dual city consisting of Berlin, which is here, north is up in this case, and Köln, which is here, and they were linked by a bridge. This notion of there being two cities, Berlin was like Buda and Pest originally, or Minneapolis and St. Paul, just as sort of a note to the history of Berlin. When the Soviets and the East German government redivided Berlin with a wall, one of the rationales that they used was that Berlin had always been two cities. So, so this is just how Berlin started. Basically, it's divided into four quarters here. There was a major street here that went up to Königsberg. When Berlin became a Residenzstadt, this became the area of the Royal Palace, which is an issue today, which we'll see at the end of the lecture. The Lustgarten is here. This area is now the Museumsinsel up here with Schinkel's Altes Museum, which is located there. Each one of these city quarters had its own church and its own marketplace. As it grew, it had a fortified wall around it. Berlin is also not very old. That's also a very important point to remember, is that in comparison with Paris or London, Berlin is not a Roman city. Even the Goths didn't want to live there. The Goths all wanted to go to Rome. I mean, everything's better in Italy anyway. And so nobody really settled in this area except for the Slavs. And the name Berlin is not of German origin. It's actually from a Slavic word called Burl, which means swamp. And so therefore nobody wanted to settle in this region because it was simply swampy. And it remained, and this is another important thing to remember about Berlin, is it remained a very, it was always a very contested area geopolitically. It was into the 9th and 10th centuries, it was one of the only areas that remained non-Christianized. It was a pagan area because of the Slavic influences, and it was therefore a contested area between the Christianized areas of the West, Western Europe, and Christianized Poland, and they were competing with each other for dominance over Berlin. So Berlin essentially is in terms of European cities, it is a very new city. It has also been, because of its geopolitical positioning, it is also a city that's been conquered a number of times. It's also been destroyed a number of times. So I won't go into the whole history of that, but it's something just to sort of keep in in the back of one's mind. This is then Berlin as a fortified structure and as a united city. This is, again, the Royal Palace here. And this is what became Unter den Linden, leading into the Tiergarten to the west, and just sort of a slow growth of areas outside of the wall. And this is Berlin as it continued to grow in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is the beginning of the dissolution of the fortified structures here, the extension of Berlin into the Friedrichstadt here, which is now the inner part of the city. This is what became the Gendarmenmarkt with the Schinkel Schauspielhaus, which I'll also speak a little bit about at the end, as well as the two cathedrals here, the French cathedral in the north and the German cathedral in the south. They're not yet in this plan, but that's where they're located. This is the famous Friedrichstraße here. This is Leipziger Straße along this axis. This is Unter den Linden. Again, this is the Royal Palace here. And these are the three major, let's say, city squares, as it were. This was called the square, this was called the octagon, and this was called the rondel until the German victories against Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. And then they were renamed, and this became Pariser Platz, and this became Leipziger Platz, also in relation to the battle against the French that the Prussians won in Leipzig. And this is called Belle Alliance, and Belle Alliance is the German designation for Waterloo. So these all indicate the rejection of the French culture, everything that happened at the beginning of the 19th century. This was here, this line indicates what was an excise wall. And the excise wall remained in Berlin until the early part of the 19th century, when it was finally taken down. It was simply for collecting taxes on the one hand, and it was also for keeping the army, because it was not only a Residenzstadt, it was also a Garrisonstadt, so the army was stationed within the city, and it kept recruits from easily deserting, so the gates were always locked. This area became, right along here, the line of the wall that was built in 1961. What became Potsdamer Platz is outside of the city here, and it was here where the Potsdamer Bahnhof was, the train station was inserted basically into the scheme. There were a whole series of N train stations that then were located all around this perimeter here. And Potsdamer train station was the first one, and that is what generated Potsdamer Platz. Potsdamer Platz was never inside the traditional part of the city. It's also an important point to remember. This area here became the area for the Reichstag. And the Reichstag, in terms of the images that you'll see during the course of the talk, I won't talk a whole lot about the Reichstag, but just keep track of the images because they're very different representations of the Reichstag itself. But again, the Reichstag was never within the confines of the city. As a quasi-democratic institution, as a parliamentary institution, it was actually outside of this royal city. And then there's one more here, which is this one. This is the Hobrecht plan of 1862. And again, this shows the inner part of Berlin, the expanded part of Berlin as per this plan. Again, the three points that we can see here, Pariser Platz, Leipziger Platz, and Belle Alliance. And this forms the core of Berlin. And the Hobrecht plan was basically to organize this very, very flat topography for the speculative development of the mid-19th century. This set the groundwork for Berlin growing from a city of under 500,000 before the middle of the 19th century to 4 million at the turn of the century. Berlin experienced explosive growth, but only in the second half of the 19th century. Berlin was always much smaller than Paris or London in the 18th century. And because of the 7 Years' War, there was also a fair amount of destruction in Berlin in the middle of the 18th century. And Berlin had a population of 55,000 around 1750 because of that. And so the explosive growth is really something that happened in the 19th century, and it happened in conjunction with industrialization. So, okay. So that is a brief introduction, and maybe I'll leave these on, actually. Okay, like any large city, Berlin has many faces, and during the past decade, the multifaceted landscape that comprises Berlin has undergone a profound transformation. Reunification has reconfigured the political contours of the city and has had a fundamental impact on Berlin's social and cultural terrain. Although architecture and urban design are its most concrete symptoms, the problem confronting Berlin today is the problem of identity, the problem of defining, creating, and maintaining a specific cultural identity in the face of a fragmented past and a globalized future. As such, Berlin shares its problems with those cities throughout the world, in which the homogenizing effects of globalization are quickly eroding all forms of local identity and culture. And, as we shall see, there are problems that remain unique to Berlin, for Berlin's fight for identity has less to do with a new vision of the future, and this is crucial to this talk, than with a new vision of the past. It is on the very unstable terrain of the historical past that the search for cultural identity collides with the politics of memory. This evening, we will examine the major themes and tensions associated with the search for cultural identity, their association with the notion of the city as the place of collective memory, and the paradoxes of a reconstruction program emphasizing memory in a city in which, because of Berlin's very particular history, there is so much one would rather forget. In the early post-reunification period, West Berlin, deprived of its exceptional status as a heavily subsidized island in a hostile socialist sea, grudgingly confronted the competitive market-oriented environment of the late 20th century. This transition has been difficult for a city comprised largely of widows, workers, and students, the latter still enamored of Berlin's mythic status as the center of the student protest of the late 1960s. One talks about this over and over again in Berlin. Arguably, East Berlin was more interested in change than its Western counterpart. Still visibly bearing the scars of the street battles that raged in April of 1945, and sorely in need of new services and infrastructure, East Berlin was both the speculator's dream and the planner's nightmare. It was also a legal quagmire. After half a century of state control, property reverted to private ownership. This great revolution backwards, and it was called that, was subject to lengthy legal disputes, particularly in the inner city areas where original owners had perished in the Holocaust, and a myriad of claims needed to be settled. During the 1990s, the massive reorganization of the legal and logistical contours of East Berlin's often ruinous inner city terrain supported both speculative development and a vibrant, if ephemeral, club and theater scene. Perhaps it's the clearest embodiment of Karl Scheffler's turn-of-the-century depiction of Berlin as always becoming and never being. Buildings left vacant by judicial disputes were provisionally occupied as bars, theaters, and clubs. Known only by word of mouth, they opened for a few nights each week and then vanished as either the police, the mainstream art scene, or the tourists moved in. While the former West Berlin districts of Schöneberg and Kreuzberg rested on the laurels of pre-reunification political activism, the contested terrain of the eastern districts of Mitte, Prenzlauer Berg, and Friedrichshain was quickly occupied by the post-reunification cultural underground. The giddy atmosphere and fluid landscape of the early post-reunification period have now begun to harden. That's clear in the city. But in order to understand the newly constructed landscape of Berlin, it is necessary to comprehend the still fluid political and ideological constructions that govern Berlin's contemporary architectural discourse. Significantly, reconstruction of both infrastructure and building substance has been followed by the recent move of the federal government to Berlin. This transition signals not just a relocation of the federal government from Bonn to Berlin, but a fundamental rethinking of West Germany's post-war insistence on the decentralization of power. Whereas Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, and Stuttgart will retain their regional importance, and Frankfurt will undoubtedly remain Germany's financial and air transportation center, Berlin is intent on reclaiming its former position as the political and cultural center of Germany, the position it had held from Bismarck's unification of Germany in 1871 until the post-1945 partitioning of Germany into Soviet and Allied sectors. This is again another important point to remember about Berlin, is that it was only a center of Germany for a very, very brief period of time, not even 75 years. That's all. Berlin has many faces, and as Berlin reasserts its role on an international stage, it becomes apparent that many of these are Janus faces, alternately displaying or concealing a myriad of tensions. Politically, the most obvious of these concerns the legacy of Berlin as a theater of Cold War confrontation. Today, the distinction between East and West, between Ossi and Wessi, is understood less in political terms than cultural ones. In the language of the Annales School, it is understood as a difference in mentalities. In architectural terms, this division manifests itself as a resistance on the part of East Berlin to many of the architectural and urban design projects it sees as being imposed by the West. Whether in the case of the hotly disputed Palace of the Republic or the proposed densification of areas around the Karl Marx LA, the imposition of Western ideals in architecture and urban design is perceived by the East as a form of internal colonization. This is also a big issue in Berlin at the moment. If the East-West axis can be characterized by a difference in mentalities, it is intersected by the ideological distinctions of left and right. The legacy of National Socialism has left deep scars on the German political consciousness, and one can follow these lesions directly into Berlin's contemporary architectural discourse. The post-war reimportation of Bauhaus modernism as the cultural medium most capable of representing, enabling, and guaranteeing a democratic, transparent political process was the ideal governing the design of the post-war federal buildings in the former capital of Bonn. Norman Foster's glass dome on Paul Wallet's Reichstag follows in the tradition of a modernist transparent architecture while doing justice to Wallet's original glass and iron dome, which itself had been understood as a symbol of political emancipation. Nonetheless, reintroducing the figure of a dome departed markedly from the Bauhaus legacy and was hotly disputed. For many, such symbolic devices tread too closely to the imperial connotations of a Reichstag and ultimately to the overwhelming imagery of Albert Speer's project of 1936, the domed Volkshalle, which I'll show in a little bit, adjacent to the Reichstag, intended to, quote, encompass the nation as a body and to elevate it to the object of its own cult, a cult of national identity. Germany's disastrous experience with the unifying potential of fascist rhetoric rendered taboo any reference, however oblique, to Albert Speer and the classicizing architecture of the National Socialists. As with the Reichstag's dome, the 835 participants in the 1993 Spreebogen design competition for the new federal district, of which the Reichstag is a part, avoided references to Speer and his monumental north-south axis. The axis from the Spreebogen competition is oriented east-west. Clearly, Berlin is acutely sensitive to the historic and symbolic associations embodied by architecture. Nevertheless, the past decade has witnessed a growing interest in a classicizing, if not classical, architecture. To circumvent associations with the politics of the 1930s, some architects and critics have turned their attention towards the work of Carl Friedrich Schinkel and his followers. It is striking to hear Berlin's architects, today's architects, right, paraphrasing, albeit selectively, Schinkel, Karl Böttischer, and Gottfried Semper. This is all part of current architectural discourse in Berlin. You're just as likely to hear Schinkel, or perhaps it's more likely to hear Schinkel quoted than Bernard Tschumi or Rem Koolhaas, or somebody that you would expect. While it would be a mistake to dismiss this as merely a lingering postmodernist hangover, re-engaging the architectural discourse of the 19th century carries its own perils. Schinkel was an architect at the Prussian court of King Frederick Wilhelm III, and while some have dismissed Berlin's contemporary architecture as a form of post-Prussianism, George Tasso has referred to it as post-Prussianism, which I quite like, others have more provocatively attempted to theorize or re-theorize a Prussian style. First formulated at the beginning of the 20th century by the politically conservative Möller-Vandenbroek and documented in Fritz Stern's The Politics of Cultural Despair, the Prussian style is a term of identity with its own particular and very problematic history. Thus, to the polarities of East-West and Left-Right comes yet another. That of Berlin as the capital of the former state of Prussia, and Berlin as the capital of the whole of Germany. The original unification under Prussian auspices of the smaller state that comprised Germany had never been wholly accepted. During the Cold War years, as Berlin played a central role in the East-West conflict, this was an issue of lesser importance. Reunification has once again brought this ambivalence, if not hostility, towards a Prussian Berlin to the fore. However, the converse is also true. Berlin is reluctant to shoulder the responsibilities and legacies of the entire German nation. Thus, in terms of architecture, the rejection of Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial by Eberhard Diepgen, Berlin's current mayor, should not be understood as indicative of a rightist political stance. Rather, it is Diepgen's objection to Berlin's having to carry the burden of a Holocaust perpetuated by or perpetrated by an entire nation. In the elections of 1933, also an important point, Berlin did not support the National Socialists. They were catapulted to power by the right-wing states of southern Germany. It is an important point. There is a very ambivalent relationship between Prussia and the rest of the German states, and that's something that does play a role even in contemporary architectural discussions. The poles of east-west, left-right, and north-south would perhaps be subordinated to the general excitement generated by Berlin's reconstruction and the tremendous amount of energy marshaled for Berlin's move into the future, if it were not for the fact that Berlin's search for this future has been so clearly tied with its past. Nowhere is this clearer than in the theory and practice of Berlin's architecture and urbanism of the past decade. For Berlin is not concerned with simply reconstructing a damaged urban fabric. Berlin must synthesize in some coherent manner its fragmented legacies in order to forge a new identity for the future now at hand. And it is attempted to achieve this by a critical reconstruction. Berlin has a real problem. How does Berlin generate an identity out of a past that is highly fragmented and highly problematic? Conceived of as a dialogue between the traditional and the modern, critical reconstruction has turned to the tenets of Italian neo-rationalism and to Ken Frampton's notion of critical regionalism for its theoretical foundations. But the identity that critical reconstruction seeks to build upon is neither a liberal nor a pluralistic one. Rather, critical reconstruction has elevated recuperative strategies concerned with history, memory, place, and identity to the status of an imperative and a polemic. The imperative is that of creating or inventing Berlin as a, quote, European city, whatever that may be, and that will become apparent what at least Berlin thinks it should be. And it is an imperative that must be read against the background of the political, cultural, and ideological axes sketched above. The polemic, often voiced by the 68ers, the Cold War generation that first experienced Berlin as a center of radical protest against the Vietnam War and American colonialism in general, is directed against the so-called American city. So you also really have to know basically some of the history of the people who are now involved in this discussion and what their own personal background is, I think, to make sense of this whole anti-Americanism in terms of urban design that's so prevalent now in Berlin. Critical reconstruction, which at the end of 1966 was expanded to include the Planwerk Innenstadt, has delivered both the vision and the program for the reconstruction of the post-reunification city. Under the politically astute leadership of Hans Stimmen, the self-declared Pope of Construction, critical reconstruction, this is in fact a quote, critical reconstruction has also created the instruments necessary to implement this particular vision of Berlin's new identity. First as Berlin's municipal building director, then as the powerful city secretary, and now again as building director, Stimmen has both cultivated and been cultivated by a small cadre of local architects and theoreticians. To these belong Joseph Paul Kleihuss, Jürgen Savada, Hans Kohlhoff, Max Dudler, Fritz Neumeier, and Dieter Hoffmann-Axtell. Working as a tightly knit group and rhetorically positioning themselves between tradition and innovation, they have defined the architectural debate and much of the architecture of contemporary Berlin. If critical reconstruction only concerned itself with architecture, one might consider this story in strictly local terms as a system of political patronage and architectural stewardship, alternating between boosterism and self-interest, astuteness and absurdity. It would explain why a local architect such as Kleihuss, I don't know how well known Kleihuss is here in London, but he's not well known in the States at any rate, except for one project in Chicago. But he has over 40 commissions in Berlin, 40. I mean, it's really astounding. The aspirations of critical reconstruction are far greater than those encompassing architecture alone. As we have seen, the definition of a national capital and potentially a national identity is at stake. A politician may grudgingly accept Berlin as the new capital city, and an economist may dream of Berlin as a new world city, but the urban vision of critical reconstruction insists on Berlin becoming a new traditional city, a new European city, traditional European city. This has raised the stakes for the European city, civically determined, place-oriented, and tradition-bound, is contrasted with cities functionally and economically determined and lacking any real sense of place or tradition. As if echoing Madame de Stael's declaration that she would love the new cities in America, there nature and freedom speak clearly enough to the soul so that it doesn't require any memories. However, on our old part of the earth, it is necessary to have a memory. So as if echoing that, the European city, steeped in tradition and memory, is again placed in direct and explicit opposition to the American. We can now turn to some of Berlin's many faces, and I'll show you, just as a general introduction to people who don't know Berlin, just some images now. And here's just basically images of older Berlin. This is a late Baroque church on the left. This is a water tower out of the 19th century in Prenzlauer Berg on the right. It's a water tower that's surrounded by apartment buildings and is again something of a landmark. On the left, this is a street scene, sort of the nightlife of Berlin. On the Oranienburger Straße on the right, that's the Bode Museum with the East German television tower in the background. Here we have, on the left, the interior space of Jean Nouvel's Galeries Lafayette. On the right, Potsdamer Platz, under construction with the sphere that has become the IMAX cinema. On the left, the interior of the new Frank Gehry building on Pariser Platz. It has a very banal exterior. It has a pretty cool interior. And on the right, it's an image taken in the back part of what's called the Tacheles, and the Tacheles was what was left over of one of the Passagen of Berlin. It was partially destroyed, largely destroyed in the 1970s by the East German government, but it was built of reinforced concrete, so the building on Oranienburger Straße could not be destroyed because they would have damaged the surrounding buildings, and it has been left as something of a ruin, and it's the site of many studios for artists as well as sort of installations such as this MIG that was installed in the early 1990s. Berlin is also the site of the largest techno party in the world, and every June there are between 500,000 and 1 million ravers that come to Berlin, and that's obviously the image on the left. And on the right, the proud owners of, I mean, I just like the color comparisons. I mean, it really is sort of transforming one into the other, of an Aldo Rossi project, in fact, which was to comprise part of Leipziger Platz. The project died before Aldo Rossi died as well. It's not going to be built in this way. And then two images of the Reichstag wrapped up by Christo and with the Norman Foster renovation sort of underway. Okay. So, under critical reconstruction, sides have sort of been organized in terms of, in terms of how one positions themselves to much of this architecture. And the exchanges between these two sides are often very heated and ideologically charged. So one is either for or against the critical reconstruction of the Hotel Adlon, the dome on the Reichstag, the Lieberman and summer houses, Schinkel's Bauakademie, the Imperial Palace, and the entire Friedrichstrasse stretching from the old Oranienburg Gate to Checkpoint Charlie. One is either for or against Potsdamer Platz and the tunnel beneath it. One is either for or against Hans Kohlhoff or Daniel Libeskind. Here are two more just views of construction. Here is an image on the left. This is Hans Kohlhoff on the left and Daniel Libeskind obviously on the right. One is either for or against Hans Scharoun or Mies van der Rohe. These are very heated points of discussion because of the ideologies associated with these particular types of architecture. One is against the classical Mies or the modern Mies. One is again also stone versus glass. This is a hot ideological issue in Berlin. Two buildings that, I mean, just from their shape are completely similar, but in terms of their materials, have sort of brought lots of very, very heated exchanges as to what actually comprises architecture to the fore. And one is either for or against the classical Mies or the modern Mies. These are two ways of reading the National Gallery. And I was in a sort of attending a lecture that was part of a symposium a little over a year ago, where it was announced with no equivocation that actually that Mies wasn't a modernist at all. Mies is a classical architect. And the way one understands that is to look at the stone base of the National Gallery. And the little funny thing on top one shouldn't really pay much attention to. I mean, it really is all about the classical stone base of this thing. And the discussion was in fact extended to the Seagram building, that the real point of the Seagram building is the Travertine Plaza in front of it and the athletic club on the other side of Fifth Avenue that actually somehow is supposed to represent the Imperial Palace, the Royal Palace, transferred to New York. And that little 40-story thingy on top of the stone plaza, well, that's just like a little pavilion, but it's really not what the project is all about. So, I mean, and these things are meant without irony. They're actually quite serious issues. So, let's see. So one is either for or against stone or glass. All of these are ideologically laden facets of the architectural battle raging in the streets of contemporary Berlin. Each of these has a history significant enough to be examined in length and detail. More important, however, is to understand these facets as symptomatic of a problem both broader and deeper than first evident. By examining the problem, it will become easier to understand why being for glass is interpreted as being against the European city, or why being for stone can quickly lead, whether fairly or not, to associations with the Third Reich. To many, however, Berlin is not identified with the poles of east-west, right-left, north-south, or European-American. Rather, Berlin's identity is inextricably linked with the international modernism and metropolitanism of the Weimar Republic. And just to sort of call some of these images to the fore, I've just included a number of things from the late teens and the 20s and the very early 30s here, which is just in terms of, I think, the way most people really access Berlin first and foremost is through this sort of material, as well as through the writings of Walter Benjamin, who we were talking about today in another seminar. And so therefore, I'm just simply showing these. The housing estates of Hans Scharoun, Walter Gropius, Hugo Haring, Max and Bruno Taut, the illuminated shop windows in the Friedrich and Leipziger Straßen, the first European traffic light at Potsdamer Platz, the pulse of the industrial facilities, the tempo of a modern underground and city rail system, the continual influx of new arrivals at the busy train stations comprised the physical landscape of Berlin in the late teens and 20s and very early 30s. Similarly, the painfully poignant sketches of Kati Kollowitz, the lurid paintings of Ludwig Kersch, Max Beckmann, Georg Grosch, and Otto Dix, the outrageous experiments of the Berlin Dada, installations by El Lissitzky, montages by John Hartfeld, acting by Marlene Dietrich, films by Fritz Lang, criticism by Sigrid Krakauer and Walter Benjamin, the physicist Albert Einstein, the sociologist Max Weber and Georg Simmel, the writers Thomas Mann, Alfred Döblin, Vladimir Nabokov, and Christoph Isherwood, the erotic Josephine Baker, the urbane Max Lieberman, the architects Baron, Polzig, Mendelssohn, Mies, the Touts, the Lucart brothers, cabaret jazz film, and 180 newspapers. These all form the cultural landscape of Berlin in the 1920s. This was a metropolitan Berlin, a city of over 4 million from 1919 until essentially the economic collapse of 1929. I'll show a few more of these really quite amazing images of metropolitan life in Berlin. The somehow now anomalous glass high-rise of Mies. It's quite interesting to see what sort of gyrations people go to explain away Mies's glass architecture, at least for those that have claimed that Mies is really a classical architect concerned primarily with masonry. The image on the right is an image of the department store at Hermannplatz. That actually withstood the war until 1945, when it was destroyed by the NS, by the SS actually. They blew the building up so that the goods that were still in the building wouldn't fall into Russian hands. And just again, images of the, photography, Bauhaus photography and the like of the late 1920s. And these are the montages by John Hartfeld of Hitler's ascension to power, the burial of the Reichstag on the left, and Himmler's burning of the books associated with the burning of the Reichstag on the right. So, what remained after the National Socialists came to power in 1933 dissipated quickly, although not immediately. Seizing on the propagandistic potential of modern technologies and cultural expression, film, radio, sport, they deployed the scenographic and ephemeral to a degree never seen before. In terms of architecture, however, the National Socialists rejected international modernism with its glazed dynamic forms. Instead, it returned to search for a national identity and a German, or specifically Prussian architecture, together with the mythification of a distant Germanic or Aryan past. A simple dark stone facade with punched windows indicated the correct relationship of the German soil to the German soil and represented the stability appropriate to a 1,000-year Reich. Many buildings exhibiting this sort of spirit were realized, sort of move into just the scenographic potential of Nazi architecture. And this is a model, this is a scale comparison of the Brandenburg Gate to the Reichstag to what Speer had planned for Berlin for this Volkshalle, which was so large that it was projected that it would have its own microclimate. And this is the north-south axis of that Speer had planned, now turned sort of just horizontally. One point to remember here is this is Tempelhof, the airport, which is pretty far to the south already, but this axis went, many, many kilometers to the south and really eradicated this inner city structure here. This is the Reichstag, this is the Volkshalle here. Okay. Many buildings exhibiting this sort of spirit, punched windows, were realized. Housing estates with pitched roofs were built for the SS cadres. A new stadium, aviation ministry, Reichsbank, and Reichskanzlei were built. This was only the beginning, for the vision of Berlin was that of Germania, a city of 8 million party functionaries. As Albert Speer began to work on his masterpiece, the grand north-south axis cut through the center of Potsdamer Platz, metropolitanism was not the goal. Rather, it was the representation of power on a scale dwarfing anything that Rome, Vienna, Paris, or London had to offer. As the first Allied bombs began to fall on Berlin, Speer was pleased. He was, in fact, quite happy, for it would save the demolition costs associated with the task of reconstruction. And in 1945, however, Berlin lay once again in ruins. And I just wanted to show a couple of images again that are so pronouncedly important here. This is Tempelhof, seen from the perspective of an American bomber, and the results in the streets of Berlin. On the right, more images of the destruction of the inner city. The Reichstag, obviously, on the right. On the left, this is the Royal Palace as it looked in 1945. Images, just aerial images of what was left of the city, where you see the entire buildings burned out. On the left and on the right, an image of the Brandenburger Tor, the Brandenburg Gate, with the Tiergarten. All of the trees were cut down in the Tiergarten during the course of the war, and it was planted then as a potato field after the war. And all the red bits, the dark red bits on the plan on the right, are areas of essentially total destruction, and the pink bits are areas of large-scale destruction. Okay. Germany, Year Zero was the title of Rossellini's film documenting Germany's early post-war period, and nowhere was this notion of Year Zero more applicable than in Berlin. It would not be incorrect to say that for Berlin, history stopped in 1945, and at the start of the post-war period, both East and West Germany were anxious to reject histories and memories of the past, and equally anxious to develop new identities embodying their respective visions of a socialist or democratic society. The architectural embodiment of these, for Germany, new values became an immediate issue. As the two Germanys struggled to reintegrate themselves into their respective community of nations, any form of architectural nationalism was vigorously rejected. The myths of architectural origins and the virtues of the past were debunked, and the focus remained squarely on the problems of the present and the promise of the future. Thus, in the early post-war years, Berlin, both East and West, experimented with various models for a new architecture and urbanism. The first great reconstruction project was that of the Stalinallee, now the Karl Marx Allee. This was sort of a before and after in this part of the city, built under the direction of Hermann Hanselmann in the early 1950s. The Soviet vision of the future had rejected modernism as early as the 1930s, and the Stalinallee had oriented itself towards the architectural inclinations of its great patron. Its monumentalism aside, the Stalinallee exhibits many of the basic tenets of postmodern urbanism: an emphasis on the street, which is defined by low-rise buildings with stores and offices on the ground floor and living quarters above, and it has been praised by both Aldo Rossi and Hans Kohlhoff. At the time it was built, Cold War politics dictated an immediate and opposite response, and in 1956, the West initiated the first international Bauausstellung, the first international building exhibition. Under the direction of Otto Bartning, buildings in the Hanseviertel adjoining the Tiergarten, a section heavily damaged during the war, were demolished, and a strictly modernist vision of glazed towers and pavilions in the park was realized. Transparency was equated with an open and participatory political process. This was contrasted with the heaviness of classicism, whose opaque masonry walls were, for the West, emblematic of the obscure political processes associated with absolutism, fascism, and Stalinism. If there was any doubt about these associations, it ended abruptly on the 13th of August, 1961, as East Germany embarked on the greatest of its post-war reconstruction projects, the Wall. These are two buildings in the Hanseviertel, obviously, and here are two images of the Wall. Before the closure in the late 1950s and shortly before its reopening in the late 1980s. The Wall, as the ultimate fact and symbol of the politics of division, was the determining feature of Berlin for more than a quarter century. Ironically, it allowed for a rapprochement between the architecture and urbanism of East and West. Enforced separation and isolation diminished the need for an overt expression of ideological competition through architectural form, and the architecture of both East and West became more clearly determined by simply the economics of construction. During the 1960s and 70s, both East and West abandoned the inner city for the periphery. I'll show you two more here of what had become of the inner city with the construction of the Wall here. The complete isolation of the Brandenburg Tor, obviously, and on the right, you can make out the sign here. This is Potsdamer Platz, the way it looked like, looking now towards the north, towards the Brandenburg Gate. And of course, this inner city became essentially the periphery to Berlin because of this division. The center became essentially the edge, or a condition of two edges. And therefore, there was a move to the real periphery. And these are two projects in the west, the Märkisches Viertel on the left and the Gropiusstadt on the right. And these were, during the 60s and 70s, simply determined by the rationalized economics of construction. And these are two images of similar buildings, similar planning concepts in the east. On the right, this is Leipziger Straße, and on the left, this is an area right behind the Karl Marx Allee. In the 1980s in the West, this situation underwent a fundamental change. Following the tenets of postmodernism, architects returned their attention to the city center and to the city as the place of collective memory, condemning the atomization and social fragmentation engendered by utopian modernism's insistence on technological efficacy and functional separation. Postmodernism took aim at modernism's negation of history, its inability to foster cultural identity, and ultimately its failure in creating civic morality. This is important. This is this notion of the city creating, this architectural form essentially creating good citizens. Advancing the need to return to historical precedent in the urban context, postmodernism indulged in a freewheeling stylistic eclecticism while finally retaining the highly normative social goals of modernist utopianism. The futurist version of towers in the park, producing healthy, happy, and virtuous citizens, was exchanged for a classicizing vision of the town square, capable of achieving the same desired result. We'll see here, I'm going to show you two images now. One is just simply a pre-war plan of the center of the city, or actually it's a 19th century plan of the center of the city, and the construction on the left, which is Aldo Rossi's most recent project in Berlin. And I'm using this I'm not going to show the postmodernist IBA projects of the 1980s, but I mean, this will stand as a representative for those projects, and I'll get to why this building looks like this in a second. By the 1980s, this thinking was beginning to exert an enormous influence on the architectural scene in West Berlin. Not one, but two international building exhibitions were organized. IBA Old, concerned with the rehabilitation of inner-city building substance, and IBA New. Under the direction of Joseph Paul Kleihuss, the IBA New began to develop the concept of critical reconstruction and a new architectural orientation for Berlin. Since the 18th century, Berlin had successively oriented itself towards the architecture of France, ancient Greece, England, Austria, America, and the former Soviet Union. Under critical reconstruction, it turned to the contemporary neo-rationalists of northern Italy and Switzerland, Aldo Rossi, Giorgio Grassi, and Vittorio Lampagnani, in order to define an architecture appropriate to Berlin. These projects were conceived of as low-rise inner-city projects designed to repair and densify the urban fabric. Ranging from the urban villa to the perimeter block, many coyly experimented with the picturesque pre-industrial urban principles developed by Camillo Sitta over a century ago. This was international postmodernism at its best. Sometimes innovative, often ironic, and always heavily subsidized, these projects developed and extended a program of social housing that had been implemented to keep the island of West Berlin afloat. On the other hand, it was also international postmodernism at its worst, renouncing none of modernism's universal aspirations while rapidly approaching the vapidity of 19th century historicist eclecticism. As an elitist game of historical quotes completely removed from their original context, the IBA projects remained essentially ahistorical and placeless, utterly incapable of generating cultural identity. When, on November 9th, 1989, the dam containing East Berlin finally burst, and in the ensuing torrent, the problem of forging a new national identity became acute, the conceits of postmodernism were quickly washed away. What remained was critical reconstruction. If postmodernism had succeeded in returning a generalized appreciation of history and memory to the architectural discourse of Berlin, critical reconstruction, fearing the overwhelming power of outside influences, sought to bind this to the specifics of place and identity. In his History and Truth, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the problem of how to become modern and to return to sources, how to revive an old, dormant civilization and take part in universal civilization, a problem which was taken up by Ken Frampton in a seminal article entitled Towards a Critical Regionalism. In his article, Frampton posited critical regionalism as a strategy of resistance capable of resolving the paradox formulated by Ricoeur. Focusing on a triad of topography, light, and tectonics, the fundamental strategy of critical regionalism is to mediate the impact of universal civilization with elements derived indirectly from the peculiarities of a particular site. These concepts, articulated in a carefully nuanced manner in critical regionalism, were programmatically adapted to the needs of critical reconstruction. This is something that the critical reconstructionists don't talk about. They're sort of incorporation of the tenets of critical regionalism. But if you follow, as we will do very briefly here, the tenets of critical regionalism, it is really a straight sort of taking over of these principles. However, whereas Frampton conceived of critical regionalism as a rearguard action initiated by the individual and talented architect working within a specific historical context, critical reconstruction under Hans Stimmen and Joseph Paul Kleihues evolved into a highly normative campaign intent on shaping the image of an entire city. For clarity, it is worthwhile following Frampton's triad of topography, light, and tectonic. Regarding topography, Frampton asserts that, quote, a totally flat datum, which is the case in Berlin, is regarded as the most economic matrix upon which to predicate the rationalization of construction. Associating this with the tabula rasa tendency of modernization, the implementation of Berlin's Holbricht Plan of 1862 had already made it painfully evident that the totally flat datum of Greater Berlin was ideally suited to rationalized forms of construction and economic exploitation. However, the old inner city had a fine-grained structure, and this is the image on the left is the old inner city with its very fine-grained structure. You can see just the individual buildings here and how small they are in this block structure of the 18th century. The urbanist Dieter Hoffmann-Axholm defined this smallest component as the parcel. The parcel is the smallest operative entity of the city, specifically the European city. This is how it was defined. Moreover, the discovery of the urban parcel belongs, together with the legally empowered citizens, to the democratically organized politics of private ownership. One has a vested interest in the city because one owns a parcel of property in the city. One, therefore, becomes a good citizen. The ideals of private ownership and public citizenship were thus fused as guarantor of the urban ideal. Whether or not one agrees with these assumptions, the project that most closely achieves the ideal of the parcel as the guarantor of the European city is, ironically, the Hofgarten at Gendarmenmarkt, which is this complex here, where each one of these buildings is in fact a separate building, unlike the Aldo Rossi building here. Just to make the point, this is why this Aldo Rossi building looks this way. These are all supposed to be separate parcels, but in fact these buildings all have continuous floor plates. These facades are simply applied to a large block structure. The floor plates are continuous. The one project where the floor plates are discontinuous is this project, and oddly enough, this project was built by Gerald Hines, the Dallas-based developer. So in this sense, ironically, the Americans have saved the European city, I'm pleased to say. So thereafter, at any rate, after this became clear to Stimmen and the architects working on these projects that it was no longer economically feasible, this was a highly expensive project, even in this scale, it was determined by Hans Stimmen, the question came up, how big can a parcel be? And Hans Stimmen answered the question by saying, a parcel can be as big as a block. And that was the rationale that then allowed for this economic globalized development to take place, even though the buildings all were made to look as if they were all comprised of parcels. And you see this over and over again when you walk through the streets of the inner city now. Continuing with the topic of local light and a building's relationship to the natural environment, Frampton states that the, quote, generic window is obviously the most delicate point of the building, fenestration having an innate capacity to inscribe architecture with the character of the region and hence to express the place in which the work is situated. As such, this concept allows for a great deal of differentiation. Critical reconstruction, however, has restricted the potential for differentiation by elevating the punched window to a normative ideal and equating this with an architecture based on purity, simplicity, and clarity. So you see, if you go through the inner part of Berlin now, you see all of these punched windows. They're sometimes a little bit taller, sometimes a little bit wider, sometimes a little bit narrower, whatever. But this is basically the Berlin facade that arises out of critical reconstruction. When Hoffmann-Axthelm also, this is a project by Jürgen Savada now, when Hoffmann-Axthelm also began to criticize the boringness of such an architecture, he drew the wrath of the theoretician Lampignani, who wrote sort of an open public letter to Hoffmann-Axthelm, saying, without any irony, to things like this, "Dear Dieter, have you ever once tried to design such a facade? I mean, to design it well? Do you know how difficult it is to correctly balance the relationship of open to closed surfaces, to make the proportions of the windows beautiful, the details reasonable and elegant? Can you imagine how much work this is and how much creativity it requires?" And Lampignani is an important guy, you know. Anyway, known for his pithiness, Philip Johnson visited Berlin, and he was asked what he thought of critical reconstruction and what he thought of the inner city. To which he replied simply, "It's true, Kleihus has the best windows." So, and here is another window that's on the left. This is by Hans Kohlhoff. This is a facade from the Hofgarten project. But I'm using this as an illustration for something else. The last of the triad involves the concept of tectonics. In his article, Frampton insists that the primary principle of architectural autonomy resides in the tectonic rather than the scenographic. That is to say, this autonomy is embodied in the revealed ligaments of construction and in the way in which the syntactical form of the structure explicitly resists the action of gravity. I mean, Frampton is writing against scenography. Lambasting the so-called postmodern architects for merely feeding the media society with gratuitous quietistic images, Frampton conceived of tectonics as a structural poetic rather than the representation of a facade. This concept is equally applicable to either glass or stone, but again, in the search for local identity, critical reconstruction has rejected glass facades, terming them ramshackle, in contrast to the solidity of stone. Unfortunately, the ideal of a load-bearing stone construction has little in common with the techniques of today's curtain wall construction. Obviously, the building on the left, this is curtain wall construction. This stone is just a few millimeters thick or a few centimeters thick, but it's supposed to look like a bearing wall, right? I mean, this is supposed to evoke images of, I don't know what, perhaps the Colosseum or something with a Doric on the bottom and then the Ionic and the Corinthian on top, who knows? Anyway, in 1993, the architectural historian and critic Fritz Neumeier sought to resolve this conflict in an essay entitled Tektonik, das Schauspiel der Objektivität und die Wahrheit des Architekturschauspiels. Schauspiel can be translated as drama or spectacle, or more generally as staging or stage design. So therefore, the title translated is Tektonik, the staging of objectivity and the truth of the architectural production. And this links our understanding of architectural tectonics to both history and truth, in the sense of Paul Ricoeur's essay, reversing the anticipated values of each. In this article, history, although invoking associations with the postmodernist notion of collective memory, is reduced to the ahistorical universalism of our architectural unconscious. Truth is similarly inverted, appropriating Goethe's phrase that art does not need to be true, it only needs to create the appearance of truth. Neumeier recasts this as the art of building does not have to be truthful in its construction. It only needs to create the appearance of the truthfully constructed. If this inversion of the truth stretches the credulity of even the most faithful adherent of the art to the art of the tectonic, it is to be understood as a Nietzschean transvaluation of values. Neumeier elucidates a meta-level of rhetorical representation in which the truth can appear, but which in and of itself is, quote, no more truthful than a death on the stage of the theater. In other words, if scenography is convincing enough, it is the truth. Whether unwittingly or unerringly, Neumeier has hit on a truth. For the double use of the word Schauspiel in the title of his essay refers to one of the most famous of Berlin's buildings, Schinkel's Schauspielhaus. That Schinkel himself understood architecture as scenography can be inferred from his own depiction of the Schauspielhaus as the stage set for the actual Schauspielhaus, obviously the image on the right, on the night of its grand opening. Furthermore, it is possible to state that the history of architecture in Berlin is a history of scenography, begging the question as to whether there is also a scenography of history. Trying to untangle this complex interweaving of unstable truths and histories lends an added poignancy to Schinkel's lament, "I can't find any path out of this labyrinth." At the heart of the Greek labyrinth lay the Minotaur, the half-man, half-beast that devoured all those who came too near. If there is a Minotaur to be avoided in the many truths and histories of Berlin, it is the memory of National Socialism and the Holocaust. One of the difficulties facing critical reconstruction is that the sum total of its preferred architectural vocabulary, perimeter block, low-rise buildings, punched windows, and stone facades, generates buildings that are indeed part of the historical precedent of Berlin. This building on the left here is another one of, it's a building by Bernd Albers, who's another one of the critical reconstructionists. The building on the right is a building I'm going to talk about. This building on the right is neither by Joseph Paul Kleihuss nor by Hans Kohlhoff. The architect was Ernst Sagebiel, and it was built as the Third Reich's Ministry of Aviation. Hermann Göring proclaimed it to have been created, quote, this is a quote, created in the spirit of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, and it was in this building that the bombings of London and Rotterdam were planned. Today it is being restored to house the new finance ministry. At the start of this talk, I had mentioned that Berlin's fight for identity has less to do with the new vision of the future than with the new vision of the past. And it is on this very unstable terrain of the historical past that the search for cultural identity then collides with these politics of memory. In the closing minutes of this talk, I will briefly sketch the issues pertaining to the projects rendered most controversial by critical reconstruction, projects that provoke the cries of for against I'd mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and which can now be understood within the larger discussion of identity and memory. And the talk will close in with a brief look at Potsdamer Platz. To begin with, it should be noted that the two most notorious symbols of National Socialism, Hitler's Reichskanzlei, the, quote, crown of the greater German political empire, designed by Albert Speer and located in what would become the former East, and the 18th century Prinz Albrecht Palais, containing rooms redesigned by Schinkel and later occupied by the Gestapo, and finally located in what would become the former West, were demolished shortly after the end of the war. The grounds of the Prince Albrecht Palais have been turned into a site for remembrance and reflection called the Topography of Terror. The grounds of the Reichskanzlei, partially for fear of its becoming a pilgrimage site for right-wing radicals, has been essentially disappeared into the greater Potsdamer Platz area. In spite of their correctness from an architectural and urban point of view, as per critical reconstruction, no one is clamoring to critically reconstruct these buildings. Just as an image here, this is Leipziger Platz after the construction of the wall, and the Reichskanzlei stretched along this street here. And there's absolutely no trace of it left. And this area here, this is the Martin Gropiusbau, and it was this area here that was taken over by the Gestapo, and this was the Prince Albrecht Palais, which extended deep into the site with its 18th century garden here originally. This is the Hermann Göring building that I just mentioned. Okay. Okay, the attitude of critical reconstruction to the old imperial palace stands in marked contrast to this. I mean, this idea of not wanting to reconstruct, of course, the Reichskanzlei. As it had destroyed the Reichskanzlei as a symbol of fascist power, the East German government destroyed the heavily damaged palace as a symbol of imperial power. This is the destruction of the palace in, I believe, in 1951 by the East German government. So it could have been saved, but of course they destroyed it as a symbol of imperial power. Saving only the bay with a balcony from which Karl Liebknecht, upon the abdication of the Kaiser in 1918, proclaimed the new communist republic. This bay was incorporated into the East German State Council House across the street. It's the one fragment of this palace that's still left. where it stands today, and the ponderous Baroque structure of the Imperial Palace was replaced with an equally ponderous modern structure called the Palace of the Republic, which is this building, of course. This structure was closed in 1991, and since then has been at the center of a raging dispute concerning its demolition and the rebuilding of the Imperial Palace. And just to give you an overview of this, here is the Palace of the Republic. It is on the face of this building here, which you see right here, where the bay of the former Baroque palace has been relocated. This is Schinkel's Altes Museum here, and this is another building that we've got to watch here. I'll come back to this in a second. The site directly to the west of the Imperial Palace, which would have been this site here, had been occupied by the Bau Academy, which until its transfer to the newly founded Technical University in 1884, it had housed Berlin's School of Architecture. Conceived of as an architectural contrast to the comparative ornateness of the Baroque palace, historians regard it as Schinkel's first modern building. Neither its modernness nor its tentative reuse as the architectural school for East Germany served to save it from destruction. And in 1961, the Bau Academy, like the Imperial Palace, still existed after the war. The Imperial Palace was destroyed because of its association with imperial power, and the Bau Academy was destroyed 10 years later in 1961 to make way for this building, which was the Foreign Ministry of East Germany. And it was completed in 1967 by Joseph Kaiser. Following design instructions from the Soviets, the ministry was large enough to accommodate the offices of a Germany unified, but under Soviet supervision. As with all buildings belonging to the DDR, it was acquired by the new federal government upon reunification, and in 1995, this building, which had been completed in 1967, was also destroyed. Many partisans in the battle for the reconstruction of the Imperial Palace also insist, now that this building has been destroyed, that the Bau Academy be rebuilt as well. The often polemical debate pertaining to the Imperial Palace and the Bau Academy is complex, with different factions attempting to secure different goals. The reconstruction of the Imperial Palace would essentially complete the erasure of the socialist landscape at this location. Although the cost would be enormous, over 1 billion mark at present, many feel that the symbolic value of such a reconstruction is worth the price. Wishing to prove their point, advocates in 1993 erected a fabric simulation of the facade and envelope of the building, which remained in place for more than a year. This led many critics, such as Thies Schroeder, to comment that in dealing with symbols, Berlin only thinks of one thing: demolition, then building new symbols, demolition, relocation. So too, the historian Tilman Budensieg has discussed the denial of tradition, replacing the old with the new instead of setting the new next to the old, as the very essence of Berlin tradition. However, what is of concern in these examples is not that the new is replacing the old, but that the new is now claiming to be old, thus legitimizing its claim to replace the recent. Importantly, these procedures closely resemble strategies of identity and memory creation in American cities. The American sociologist and urbanist Sharon Succumb has addressed this issue in relation to such Disney creations as Disneyland, the reconstruction of Times Square, and the newly constructed Celebration City, demonstrating how Disney restores identity by inventing collective memory, inventing it now, creating main streets not as they were, but how they really should have been. Similar strategies have been employed by the new urbanists, as demonstrated in recently created towns such as Seaside. Succumb concludes that this is a form of utopianism, and that its success lies in projecting this utopianism not forwards, but backwards. In Berlin, projecting this utopian backwards collides with the real historical past, and it is therefore becomes understandable why Berlin, a city straining to invent a new collective memory, is trying with equal desperation to erase the collective memory that it already has. One of the great frustrations of Berlin is that the deeply haunting memories of its real history stand in such stark contrast to those of the shiny new historical Berlin it would like to create. Whereas Celebration's past resides only in the minds of its Imagineers, and New York's Times Square can comfortably flirt with memories of glamour and honky-tonk, Berlin's Main Street, Unter den Linden, must contend with the memories of book-burning, military parades, and occupation. It is in mediating between a fictional past and the many real pasts of Berlin that Reconstruction has assumed its critical position, selecting, revising, editing, and blending a mixture of pasts, both real and imagined. The consequence of this has become apparent in another project being built immediately to the south of the Bau Academy, the Foreign Ministry. After they destroyed the existing foreign ministry that was built in 1967, the foreign ministry was confronted with this problem of where do we put the foreign ministry now? Obviously. In 1993, the federal government initiated the Spreebogen competition for the new government center, of which the Reichstag renovation and the new chancellery are a part. By 1994, it was already clear that the federal government could not afford many of the new buildings it had planned, nor were they necessary. There was a vast surplus of unused space in the city, and this was bound to increase with the speculative investments of the private sector. So in 1995, the new foreign ministry was demolished, and because of this need to find now space in existing buildings, the foreign ministry turned to this building here, which was the Reichsbank, and said, well, we could move into this building. Now, I'll just go into the history of this building very briefly, because this building was built in the 1930s. It was also part of a competition in which Gropius, Mendelssohn, and Mies took part. This is the Mies entry into this competition. And the competition results were nullified by Germany's political leadership at that time that felt that these modernist buildings didn't represent the true spirit of German construction. And so a new competition, or it wasn't really a competition, it was a direct contract award to the house architect of the Reichsbank. And he then designed this complex here. And this is sort of montaged into the old inner city fabric where you can see the size of these parcels. And this was just sort of montaged into this. The Imperial Palace is right here, and here you see just the corner of the Bau Academy. This block was never built, but this block was built in from 1933 to, I think it was completed in 1938. And here you see the dedication ceremony of this building, where here in the background you see the sort of successful young politician from Berlin. Here's the project, and here's the very happy public. This is the dedication of this building. And so the question was, this building was not destroyed during the war. After the war, it was taken over by the East German government, and Honecker had his offices in this building. And then the question was, can the foreign ministry move into this building or not? So at first, members of the federal government maintained that the Reichsbank was simply a banking institution. So it's no problem, we'll just simply move into this building. It was just a bank. As managers of the Reichsbank had been tried at the Nuremberg war trials, this proved an untenable position and was quickly abandoned. However, Hans Kohlhoff, the critical reconstructionist responsible for the just completed renovation of the bank, insists that this is a very solid building. One has, this is a quote, one has the feeling it could stand for centuries. While thusly flirting with references to the 1,000 years of the Third Reich, Kohlhoff rejects associations of the Reichsbank with National Socialism, bemoaning that, quote, everything that has a stone facade and a large door is regarded here in this paranoid situation as a fascist building. With statements such as this, critical reconstruction has arguably come full circle, reducing the city as a place of collective memory to the city as a place of collective forgetfulness. In the case of the Reichsbank, such forgetfulness is particularly jarring. As construction was underway in 1937, the bank was featured in the architectural press. I was really curious to see how this bank was actually presented. It was featured in the architectural press with a designation by the then president of the bank. His name is Schacht. He's a very colorful character. He was very much for National Socialism, had problems with Hitler, however, and in all fairness to him, he resigned in 1939 as Hitler was really using all of the Reichsbank funds to rearm Germany in preparation for the invasion of Poland, and ended up in 1944 being imprisoned by the SS. He did, however, survive the war. But what he says in this dedication, it's this last sentence here, is that this building will become the symbol for the building of the Third Reich. So he's equivocating this building in and of itself with the building of the Third Reich. Seeking to readdress such difficult histories, Fritz Neumeier has recently argued that classical architecture has been so abused. We can see this here. This looks like an Aldo Rossi thing. Fritz Neumeier has recently argued that classical architecture has been so abused by the political agendas of both the left and the right that it should now be free of all associations. However, if one follows this line of reasoning, the classicizing architecture in Germany of the 1930s was not designed by National Socialists, it was simply designed by good architects. And again, I went back through the old editions of Bauwelt to see what was being featured a few issues before the Reichsbank. And here it's the building by Trost in Munich, the new art museum with the Day of German Art, which is, of course, where the Degenerate Art exhibit took place, and this was on the 15th of July, 1937. And the project that followed the Reichsbank, just to contextualize all of this, is Speer's project. This is 16th of September now, 1937, is the Speer project in Nuremberg. So this would just simply be good architecture at this point in time. Similarly, it is claimed that the classicizing tendencies of today's critical reconstruction have no political or social significance. In this scenario, the disassociation of architectural values from social values catapults architecture out of the realm of the normative into that of the absolute and serves to elevate the position of the architect to the oracular figure beyond the reach of history. So the architect is now sort of moved out of the realm of the historical entirely. This is a difficult discussion and not one in which the federal government was happy being a participant. So what the federal government did is it sponsored a competition to build a new foreign ministry as a kind of mask in front of the Reichsbank, because they knew that they couldn't really use the Reichsbank for the symbol now of a democratic federal republic. So here in section we see the Reichsbank. And this was the first prize winner. This is a project by Max Dudler. And again, we see these very highly developed facades here with these beautifully proportioned windows that Lampagnani was talking about. What's also interesting is that in all of these perspectives, we see the outline of the Bau Academy being replaced in this, so that, as we'll see in a moment, as the competition was sort of written out, the Bau Academy was given as a given, as if it had already been reconstructed. It, of course, hadn't been. So this project won because of its urban design relationship to the Bau Academy, which, of course, didn't exist. So again, with compliments about this being such a wonderful facade. When the federal government saw this, they'd reserved the right to nullify the jury results. And they did. The federal government saw this. They said, there's no way that we can. This is just simply an extension of the Reichsbank building. Here we see the Reichsbank in the back, and this simply is an extension. This is not the mask that it should be. So they then ended up awarding the first prize to the the contract for construction to the second prize winners, which had organized this project here. This is the Dudler plan, this is the Bau Academy, this is the Reichsbank. And this building has now just been completed. Okay. But what's interesting in all of this is that Dudler took the Bau Academy as part of his exterior perspective, interpreting Schinkel's first modern building. This is the way Schinkel's building the Bau Academy has always been described, as an exemplar of modern classicism. In contrast to this, Müller and Reimann, who actually got the project, and this is the interior perspective of the Müller-Reimann project on the left. Müller-Reimann have incorporated a reference to the entry hall of the Altes Museum, also by Schinkel, on the right, interpreting one of Schinkel's later classical works as an exemplar of classical modernism. So negotiating these fine lines between modernist classicism or classicist modernism is a high wire act of differentiation. However, when this thin line is understood as separating tendencies towards democracy or fascism, the politics of memory become a central issue. Although its intentions may have been admirable, it is possible, indeed necessary, to become critical of critical reconstruction. If critical reconstruction has insisted on developing a local Prussian identity based on the classical principles of purity, simplicity, and clarity, and if the German federal government has remained more or less loyal to a national identity based on the modern principles of democratic transparency, and we can see these just completed photographs where it's still a kind of Berliner architecture, but this is the completed project now of Müller and Reimann. On the left, the interior view built, and on the right, the view of the exterior, which also shows its masking function to the Reichsbank in the back. So here we have a kind of modernist masking of this classicist architecture of the 30s. But what would one say, if this is all an issue now that we've been talking about in terms of democratic transparency, what would we say about Potsdamer Platz? And in closing this talk, we shall see that Potsdamer Platz offers us the true story, one in which politics, identity, and memory are reconciled in an easily consumable and highly American format. So we'll turn to Potsdamer Platz now, just in the closing of this talk. And I want to show, since we've been showing images of Schinkel, on the left, this is Potsdamer Platz to Schinkel's time. Potsdamer Platz is outside the city and is occupied by 5 kids and a dog. And there is 2 sort of gatehouses which were for collecting taxes, which form the entry to Leipziger Platz. And in the 1920s, Leipziger Platz had the first traffic light in all of Europe, and this is a postcard from the 20s then. The image on the right is Leipziger Platz just beyond Potsdamer Platz in, before the war, also in the 1920s, and Leipziger Platz, which you can see just here after the war and after the demolition that was associated by the construction of the wall. And you just simply see the trace of this octagon. And here is a view of Leipziger. This is the train station, or Potsdamer Platz. This is the train station here. This is the great intersection once again, and what it was like looking from the west towards the east as the wall was in place. It was just simply a field. And once again, we see the wall in the background here. And this is what was left of Potsdamer Straße. This is the famous street. It was simply this alley of trees in the middle of nowhere. And this was the one existing building that remained of Potsdamer Platz. Well, there's a fragment of another building, but this was the one that really did still stand, and it's been incorporated into the redevelopment. There were a series of projects, of competitions for Potsdamer Platz after the wall came down. And in fact, it's important to realize that in early 1989, before the wall came down, there are already sort of secret inquiries being made on the part of Daimler-Benz to see if eventually they could purchase this area for development. And so when the wall came down, they were well in place. And so there were a series of urban design competitions. There were a series of architectural competitions. What's important here is simply, I mean, we all know that who won the urban design competitions, and I'll show you just some images of that. But this was the project. This had won a 5th place prize by Hans Kohlhoff. It was his 2nd competition entry for Potsdamer Platz, and this was what really delivered the imagery of critical reconstruction, the imagery of low-rise buildings with classicizing facades. So it's really Kohlhoff that delivered this imagery. At any rate, as construction started on Potsdamer Platz, and it was a huge construction project, one of the important points in all of this is that the water table in Berlin lies about 1 meter below the surface of the land, so that in order to do these low-rise buildings, in order to make them at all economically feasible, there's an amazing amount of work that needs to be done underground, and that work is in fact very, very expensive work. So as they started digging for the foundations, they let these foundations be flooded, and all of the original foundation work that was done for these buildings was done by scuba divers. And it was really quite fascinating to see in the middle of winter, when it was a very cold winter, that all of these construction sites were frozen over, and they had actually chopped holes into the ice, and the scuba divers would go down and do their foundation work. It really was quite an amazing engineering project to bring about this notion of the traditional European city. And this is sort of the kick to all of this over and over again. One of the things that was also done is piano avoided this whole fight between, or this whole discussion between glass and stone by insisting on terracotta, which of course he had used in Paris once before, so once again we have a sort of different alignment. Here is the end of Richard Rogers' building. This is the theater building, which makes its allusions to Hanscha Ruhn's Staatsbibliothek, the state library, in terms of its cladding. Just two images here. And one of the other things that was built in Berlin is the info box here, which has had an amazingly successful career, which was aligned with Potsdamer Straße here. It runs parallel to it and contained all of the models exhibiting what was going to be done on the site or in other parts of the city. And it was really, it was simply the information box that it was. It, of course, is also scheduled for demolition. So, and as it was inaugurated, as in fact it was opened, Hans Stimmen said, it's a nice building, but in the long run, it's nothing for the Berliner eye. It will have to come down. And here are two images now of Potsdamer Platz completed. This is the south side of Potsdamer Straße. Sony is to the north. And, Potsdamer Platz was opened in October of 1999, and the Sony Center will have its grand opening this coming June. By all accounts, Potsdamer Platz is a success. Admittedly, the architecture is sometimes dazzling, and although all references to the historical Potsdamer Platz have been erased, except, of course, for the name itself, in the middle of Potsdamer Platz, one does find a Marlene Dietrich Platz. This is the Marlene Dietrich Platz, the town square that is so valued in postmodern urban thinking. Marlene Dietrich is not well liked by the Germans, however, for she is seen as having spurned Hitler's Germany for the glitter of Hollywood, returning only with the victorious Americans. Perhaps this explains why the square is graced with America's favorite hamburger chain, as we see. Highly controlled, this public square originally offered only one public bench, which is occupied by a figure of Ronald McDonald. Similarly, it's great. Similarly, the surfaces in the southern part of the complex, which we see here, areas exposed to the sun and ideal for the summer season are covered with water in order to regulate and control public movement. This is a very, very, very highly controlled situation. It is a kind of staging of urbanity. This is a longer discussion, but it simply stages urbanity. There's nothing urban about this. The control of space and movement in the exterior areas leads one very quickly to the heart of Potsdamer Platz, the arcade. There it is, the arcade. The arcade projects. All of the references to Benjamin are back. Although the name promises the final release into the traditional European city so eagerly sought by critical reconstruction, the results are unexpected. The heart of Potsdamer Platz, as you'll see in a minute, is little more than a two-story shopping mall with a basement, a shopping mall that would most likely not pass muster in a city like Cincinnati or Manchester. Security is present, it's ever present, and until all of the bad press about New York and Giuliani and the brutal police, the security in the shopping mall was actually dressed like New York City police. They were men in blue. So to what history, identity, or memory does one turn to explain this? This is the entry, the basement entry from the subway station into the arcade. And here one makes the comparisons. These were photographed at exactly the same time. All the people going into the arcade, and that nobody's really going up the stairs to the actual city, street, right? Sort of reconstruction of the European city. It could be argued that the traditional European city center, despite a decade of fierce resistance, has nonetheless succumbed to the inevitable processes of globalization, a term which, as the urban sociologist Perry Anderson has recently argued, may just be another word for Americanization. It could also be argued that Potsdamer Platz was always outside of the city, on the periphery, and that therefore one should expect the much-hated hallmark of the American periphery, the shopping mall. If one continues through this mall, one finds perhaps the ultimate twist in the politics of memory. And so here is entering into the wall before Christmas. Here is another interesting point, which I like this. This is how Potsdamer Platz is being marketed. These are two happy young women with their Erlebnis-Einkauf, sort of the experience of shopping, right? And they're running down what's supposed to be Potsdamer Platz, but in fact they're carrying a bag which is called Old Navy. And there are no Old Navy stores in all of Germany. This is probably a photograph taken from New York, marketed by a photo agency in Munich as being the image of the new European city center of Berlin. It's great. And if one goes further into the mall, one comes into the very end of it. Here is, again, right before Christmas. And one ends at this place, which is called the American Sports Bar, replete with football videos and Frank Sinatra serving hamburgers and ribs and offering a free newspaper. If God, as is often claimed, is truly in the details, then this newspaper offers us an unexpected answer. It is the true story, which we'll see here. This is the outside cover of the paper, and whoop. Yeah. Here's the true story. It is the true story in which one in which Europeanism and Americanism are reconciled in the figure of Joe Playowski. As Walt Disney had recreated Bavaria's Schloss Neuschwanstein for the first Disneyland, we find, if one reads through the true story here and the history of all of this, we find that it was Playowski who, as a German immigrating to America in 1906, before all of that nasty stuff started with the wars and everything, invented not only the hamburger, but also that hallmark of the American periphery, so, the drive-in. The inference is clearly that many of the successful forms of Americanism circling the globe, from hamburgers and drive-ins to the shopping mall, are actually of German origin. By inventing this new past, projecting this utopia backwards, Potsdamer Platz and the critical reconstructionists of Berlin have skillfully manipulated the politics of memory, seamlessly appropriating this symbol, the shopping mall, of the American city as its own true European identity. Thanks. My own personal view. I think one of the things that I find, I've asked the question in order to make it clear to myself, I suppose, is that how does one deal with fascist architecture in Italy? And I think the Italians deal with it in a relatively matter-of-fact way. They say, this is fascist architecture. It was a fact, and they can somehow fit it into their longer history, their greater scheme of things, and simply say, okay, it was the case. I think the problem right now, the problem that I see particularly with Kohlhoff, is that there's a denial that it's fascist architecture. It's simply saying it's not fascist architecture, it's just classical architecture. And I think that's where the problem starts. Germany, of course, has another big problem because Italy, even though it says fascist architecture, it isn't confronted with the Holocaust, and that's the problem that Germany has to confront. So as soon as you say fascist architecture, as soon as you say the NS, you have the problem of the Holocaust sort of in the middle of all of this as well. But I think the real problem right now, what I find very interesting, and it's very interesting to read the papers because everything in Berlin is so politically charged. So there was the dedication to the Holocaust memorial after many years of problems and argumentation and the like. I think it was on the 27th of January. It was on a Thursday, and it was carried in the press, and Schroeder was there, and Diepgen was not there, the mayor of Berlin. He boycotted it. On the Friday after that Thursday, a group of neo-Nazis asked for permission to organize a demonstration against the Holocaust Memorial. Usually these things are denied out of, reasons that it has to do with too much police control and there's too much potential for confrontation between the right and the like. But somehow, and there are reasons for this that surfaced in the paper afterwards, and they're supposed to all be, just sort of mistakes and not paying that much attention to all of this, but somehow they were in fact given the right to protest against the Holocaust Memorial. And so on that Saturday, the neo-Nazis basically were allowed to march for the first time since 1945 through the Brandenburg Gate. And I would say, I mean, nobody can really miss the symbolic importance of all of that. And 2 weeks later, Haider comes to power in Austria. So I think there are things that you really have, I mean, you really should call a spade and say that there are these tendencies, there are these issues. And I think one of the real problems in this critical reconstructionist discourse is that there is a complete attempt, I mean, a very systematized attempt to dehistoricize this architecture, the way the architecture is photographed, the way it's published, the photographs of, I mean, the one that I showed of the, at the very, very beginning of Hans Kohlhoff and his sort of low-down camera angle view into this model. If you compare that in terms of its black and white formatting, in terms of the way it's published, if you compare that with the Speer photographs of the New Berlin, of Germania, from the 1930s, I mean, it's simply there. So he's trying to decontextualize his own architecture. He's also trying to decontextualize Speer's architecture, and simply to say, well, it's all just architecture. You know, don't worry about it. And I think that's a problem. I think that would be my attitude towards it. I don't think that one should demolish the Reichsbank or something like that. Kohlhoff tried, I think in all fairness to Kohlhoff, I mean, he did have a program of saying there were 3 layers of the Reichsbank. There was the NS layer, then there was the communist layer, and now there's supposed to be the new federal government layer. But somehow the whole thing sort of, you know, looks like this big, more or less classical soup because of its own tendencies. And one would have to say, what would an architect like Banish have done with this building? I mean, who would really have probably done something that accepts the original building but does something in clear contrast to that. And I think that's a problem. And what's interesting, what I find so fascinating, is that it's all being done under the guise of, you know, reestablishing the traditional city. That's what's so fascinating. That's what's so, I mean, in the end, becomes rather frightening or potentially frightening because people then do forget the real history. Yeah.
I mean, I think your arguments are very interesting, and the only thing I find a bit, disappointing is it is too academic. I mean, you start with the mention of the Swan, which I think is an indication. When you look at all the things, I mean, the only way to really regenerate Berlin is to erase all those new buildings, because I mean, these secular fascists possible.
Which new buildings? The ones that are being built.
Kohlhoff and Kleihuis and all this. I mean, Schinkel is modern in a way against those buildings. It's freer. It's more.
Well, it depends which Schinkel as well, right? I mean, there's an early Schinkel. There's a.
But I mean, the Schinkel buildings which have this stage set bit with it, which is a kind of irony towards a reality.
Yeah.
So it stays classic elements, but at the same time it ironizes it through the stage set element.
Yeah.
In it, you know? And I mean, I just wish that you would have guided it more from the word swan, because I think that's the only right characteristic for Berlin politics for ages. Sorry.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's one take on it. Well, I mean, I've been toying around. I mean, I have to say, Potsdamer Platz was completed in 1999, at least the southern part of it. And, you know, I've already been playing around with the project of reconstructing Potsdamer Platz. So I think in terms of the tradition of Berlin, I think your wish that some of these buildings will go away will probably be the case. I think that, I mean, that just seems to be.
Yes, the only interesting building really is the information box.
There are a few other buildings that are interesting. There are a few intelligent comments on all of this as well.
But it's also shy, and it's also making compromises of buildings. There are even Renzo Piano. You know? I mean, you still can see it in details. It's Renzo Piano, but in general, Hans Kohlhoff.
Yeah.
I mean, they all. I mean, even Richard Rogers with this neo-Sharon thing. You know, I mean, they all so.
Well, one of the.
To build,
Yeah. Well, one of the individuals, I mean, one of the things you have to look at is how much power Stimmen actually has. And if Stimmen wasn't Stimmen, it might have developed in a very different way. It might have been very productive. But one of the things that's so remarkable about Stimmen, I mean, people who are from Berlin know this, people who aren't from Berlin don't know this, is that architects, and I know many architects, I mean, prominent architects from large architectural offices, they would do a design sketch, they would win an urban design competition, and then, well, okay, what does the thing look like? And they would do an an architectural sketch saying, well, it looks like this, And they would literally roll up all of their sketches, and they would go to Stimmen's office, and they would say, well, do you like it? And Stimmen would say, windows are too big, make them smaller. And they'd say, all right, and then they would go back. And they were forced to do this because basically if you don't do this, you shut yourself out of all possibility of getting further contracts in Berlin. So some people really held their ground against this, and they did their one project in Berlin. But it was only the one project. The people who really have repeated projects are the people who play along.
But in a way that repeats the problem. I mean,
of course.
Since it can't have been a conscious intention to give him that much power.
It was a conscious intention. That's the other interesting thing about this, because the architects in 1989, Kleihuss 1990, wanted to save Berlin from global speculative development. They wanted to control it in some way. It's a legitimate concern. And so they then, when Kleihuss and Kohlhoff, the story that sort of circulates generally is they got this guy Stimmen, who was a traffic planner in Lübeck, and and he does have architectural training. He had worked as an architect. He had worked as an architect on a high-rise building in Frankfurt, and he didn't like it. And so then he went back to Lübeck, and they sort of brought him basically to Berlin to control all of this. I don't think their intention was that it would form this symbiotic relationship. They explained the history of architecture to Stimmen, that it started with the Greeks and went to the Romans, and then went to Schinkel, Gilly, and Kleihuss. Yeah? And But this is actually what drives it. I know so many architects that think that way. I've had architects explain the history of architecture to me in 15 minutes and say, you're from America, I'll tell you what European architecture is about. And they do this in a very generous way. And in 15 minutes, I know all of European architectural history. It's amazing. It's the emphasis on the street. I mean, it's this notion of the traditional European city street and the traditional European city plaza, Platz, right? Which is the guarantor of public space, as it were. And the other things, like the Scharoun, like the Kulturforum, it's very interesting to see how they're presented. I mean, they really are presented as wastelands with all of the connotations that are associated with that. And the Scharoun, the Staatsbibliothek, the State Library, as well as the Philharmonie, are talked about over and over again. You see this. This is really a sort of figure in the contemporary discourse, is that they are dinosaurs. And they're dinosaurs roving around this wasteland. And then these, it's said, some people like that. There's some artists, they like dinosaurs in the wasteland. But really serious people who really want a city and, they... No. Yeah. Now, Potsdamer Platz is an amazing place because it really is a machine designed to get people into that mall, right, or into one of the movie theaters, or into the casino. But there's, to some extent, very kitschy buildings. But at any rate, the Helmut Jahn complex does have a center which is open, it is outside, and you do have the sense there that somewhere you come to some kind of stasis where you can actually sit and look at something without buying a hamburger.
And I think that's normal everywhere. The interesting fact is neo-fascist appearance and
Yeah, but then,
mentality.
but I think, well, I mean, I think the interesting question is also how do you use these? I mean, okay, I mean, we have that with the appearance. I think that's clear enough. But it's also how places like Potsdamer Platz actually work. That the whole notion of Platz, the whole Marlene Dietrich Platz, it's not a Platz at all. I mean, it's a non-space. It's a non-space.
With a Marlene Dietrich Platz, did you see this one man doing having the arm up? Perhaps he thinks that.
No, I didn't. Unintentional.